This is assignment 4.1, Ethical and Legal Issues in Sport and Exercise Science Research. So obviously here you can see some images such as the Nazi experiments, the Nuremberg Code and Declaration of Helsinki. These are all background to legal and ethical issues. Like starting with the Nazi experiments, during the Second World War the Nazis were experimenting extreme states to see how the body would cope with it to help improve their chances of winning the war. However, they didn't do this on willing participants. They were forced to do it. They were doing it on prisoners of war or POWs. They were doing like I said before, they were doing it so they could see how the body would cope with extreme states, such as being submerged in really cold water or being put into a high altitude simulation, so to test how their pilots would cope with it. And because of this, after the Second World War had finished in 1947, the Nuremberg Code, which you can see an image for there, was put into place. This is the code that researchers had to and still have to follow. This code makes sure that anyone that is conducting an experiment would, to the best of their ability, conduct it in a safe manner and not put themselves or the people that were partaking in the research or being experimented on, made sure that they wouldn't be in danger as well. The Nuremberg Code consists of 10 points that every researcher has to follow, and they have to make sure that they do indeed follow every single one of these 10 points. So I'm just going to read off a few of them. So to begin with, one of the big ones is the voluntary consent of the people that are partaking in it. You can't force them to do it. They actually have to physically choose and say, yeah, okay, I'm going to willingly partake in this experiment. So, again, going back to the Nazis would force POWs to do it and do all these horrible experiments, and they wouldn't even know what was going on, whereas these volunteers would know exactly what was going to happen to them, how it was going to happen, and then they would still want to do the experiment. Also, another big one would be to make sure that there is or to make sure that when they're doing the research there is no prior reason to believe that death or disabling injury can occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. Once again, going back to the Nazi experiments, they just wouldn't care about what would happen to the POWs that they forced to actually do the experiments. Whereas now you have to take really, really big precautions. You need to make sure that no one will even have a chance of being hurt in such a bad way like this, which is why this rule has been put into place. Also, following that point, researchers also have to make sure that they are ready to stop the research or the experiment that they're doing if they have reason to believe that death or really bad injury or just any injury whatsoever will occur. So say that they were doing submerging people in really cold water, and they would need to do a health screening questionnaire to make sure that people were able to cope with that, and then they just wouldn't continue with the experiment. They would terminate it right there if they realised that the people were just not ready or wouldn't be able to cope with it. Now for Helsinki. Along with the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki was developed by the World Medical Association, and it was put into place to protect human participants that are having research conducted on them. It was first introduced in June of 1964. It is consistently being revisited to make sure it isn't out of date and make sure that there's make sure everything's up to date, make sure that the code still applies to everything that's going on, all the research that's going on. Some of the outcomes from both the Declaration of Helsinki and the Nuremberg Code is that participants must volunteer, which I mentioned earlier. They should also make sure that the benefits of the research do outweigh the risk, just to make sure that what they're doing is actually worth it. Now onto the ethical and legal issues. As you can see here, for ethical, I've written down what is morally right. This means when you're working ethically, you need to make sure that you are doing what's morally right and just avoiding what would be morally wrong. So say if you were going to knowingly put someone in a situation where it could harm them, would you actually go through with that because it would be morally wrong for you to do that, or at least you would hope it would be? And legal, quite literally, is what does the law say? Are you working within those civil law boundaries? Are you making sure that you're not overstepping it? Are you making sure that everyone is safe? Which is, once again, one of the main factors that can affect this. So for the Ethics and Review Committee, this is a committee that you would have to, when you want to do some research, you would have to make sure that you send off one of these really long project proposal forms stating every single step, everything you're going to be controlling, everything you're going to be changing, everything you're going to be measuring, literally everything, all the details of your experiment, how it's going to go out, like the protocol, everything like that. And then from that, they will weigh out the benefits versus the risk, which you should have done already as a researcher yourself to make sure that it is safe, and so that you can actually proceed with the research, proceed with the experiment. And if everything is okay, they will give you ethical clearance. But with ethical clearance, you would need to seek this from a recognised body. These can include the NHS Research Ethics Committees and the NHS Research Authority. This is where they will check over your application. They will make sure that your work is for a good cause. They'll make sure that you can actually go ahead with it. They'll just give you the go ahead or tell you what you'll need to improve on. Say you've done something that isn't quite right or isn't up to standard, then they will correct you on it. And then once you've gone over it, changed your protocol, you can submit another one and then see if that one will be okay. Or if they just don't agree with the experiment or what you're intending to experiment with, then they will just tell you no, and they will stop you from stepping over the boundaries. So for BASES, what is BASES? BASES is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, and it is the professional body for sport and exercise science in the United Kingdom. This means that if someone wanted to conduct an experiment, they would first need to get ethical clearance from an ethics committee, which I talked about on the previous slide, and then they would need to get accredited by BASES, but BASES will only accredit them if they've been had an ethical clearance. They'll need to be accredited. And they will need to fit the criteria from BASES in order to be accredited. So for the BASES Code of Conduct, it's essentially just a list of rules that they're going to want you to apply by. These include professional standards, informed consent, which we'll get onto in a moment in quite a lot of detail because it is a legal requirement, very, very important. Competence and confidentiality, and that's just hitting the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that's actually in the Code of Conduct, but that's what we're going to be focusing on at the moment. So for professional standards, they would want to make sure that you'll be protecting participants' data, which is a huge, huge factor about it. You need to make sure that you're not putting anyone at risk by releasing data, making sure that can't harm them emotionally or physically. This data protection comes under the Data Protection Act of 1998, and members must ensure that they are familiar with the principles established by this act, and that their experiments do accord with it, or with the principles. They need to make sure that they don't overstep. They need to make sure that they do abide by this act and make sure that everyone is safe when they're using their data, so they can't just release it without consent or anything like that. The professional standards can also include professional conduct. So the people that are conducting the experiment, the researchers, they must ensure the well-being for all the participants. They need to make sure that they don't harm themselves. They need to make sure that they are giving credit to everything that they use, like all the other research and everything like that. Make sure that they don't actually plagiarize, because that can lead to different types of punishments. So for informed consent is a legal requirement, and it is basically all of the people that are being experimented on, all of the participants, they must know exactly what is going to happen to them, how it's going to be happening to them. And if there is deception involved or anything like that, say you're doing a placebo, a double-blind trial, or just a blind trial, they need to have a debrief at the end, and they need to make sure that they do know exactly what's been happening. Also, say you are doing a placebo, you need to make sure that what you're using instead, say just sugar, something else like that, something that's replacing the actual product, you need to make sure that you're at doing a health screening questionnaire beforehand, because this can identify if they're diabetic and you're using sugar as a replacement, because that can be quite harmful if they don't realize, or if you just allow them to take the sugar without them knowing. So essentially it is just a form that they have to read through, and they have to read through it and then sign, and when they sign they're saying that, okay, yeah, I know what's going to happen to me, so I give my consent still. I'm not backing out at this point, even though they can still back out later if they feel like they want to, or they're not comfortable with something that's happening in the research or in the experiment. So for confidentiality, it links in quite heavily with the data protection laws. This because you need to make sure that all of their, say you've taken in the home address because you're doing groupings from a certain area, their name, their phone number, all their contact details. You need to make sure that you don't release that to public, because then that's an invasion of privacy, and if other people do get it, then they can literally do whatever they want with that information, and the people won't even know that they would have it. All these other people would have it, which could be really bad if, say, they started mailing them, email them, phoning them for no reason, anything like that. Lastly, for competence, the researchers must recognise their limitations and qualifications and experience, everything like that. They need to know their limits. They can't overstep themselves. They can't overextend, because that's putting everyone in danger, not just themselves. It's putting in all of the participants as well, and that it just is really dangerous, because they can become injured. They could have health issues, anything like that. Also, as knowing their own limitations, they need to tell the participants their limitations, their qualifications, stuff like that. Make sure that they don't lie about them as well, because then it might make the participants overconfident and make them think that nothing bad can happen to them, when in fact it can, because they're not actually qualified to do anything like this. Now onto scenario 1. As you can see in this scenario, they gave them a health screening questionnaire, which is great because you need to actually identify if the participant is allergic to anything. Say if they've got diabetes, then they can't be taking sugar supplements instead of whatever you want to be experimenting on, and using sugar as a placebo, because this can really affect them. It can cause things such as comas if their blood sugar is either too high, too low, and by giving them more sugar, it will be pushing them way too high, which it just isn't right to actually know that and still go ahead. Also, as you can see, by how when one of the gymnasts doesn't feel comfortable after seeing a demonstration of the PNF training, they are allowed to leave, which is good, because that's something that they should be allowed to do. They have the right to withdraw. They're not, or they shouldn't be, forced to participate and then stay in the experiment. They shouldn't feel pressured. They just shouldn't be forced into being into that position where they believe that harm can be caused to their person. Also, when it says that they were told that this stretching will definitely increase their skill level in gymnastics, that's deception, because in the case that it doesn't, then they're still led to believe that this actually will help them, whereas in some cases it might not do anything for them apart from just make them waste a few minutes of their life, because they're just taking part in something that doesn't benefit them in the slightest.